Hi everybody, my name is Keegan and I get the opportunity to kick off this week's lunchtime devotionals. The theme which we will be diving into this week will be that of creating a clean heart. The goal with this week of devotionals is not only to provide a sense of stability in the midst of this crisis, but to guide you in potentially discovering or rediscovering practical ways to be mindful, hopefully to the point of cleansing your walk with God. In fact, therein lies the subject of this devotion. The first way we dive into fulfilling that goal of creating clean hearts is simply through dwelling in God constantly. Of course, that's one of those things that sounds easier than it actually is. I hope that this can act as a reminder, not only for me, but for you, that dwelling in God will tremendously aid you in fighting our battles, leaving you fulfilled. Or at least, that's how David speaks about God in the Psalms. Specifically, Psalm 16:11 is where this devotion is centered. Psalm 16:11 reads, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." If you're one who's been looking for a manner to be fulfilled, if you haven't been able to find joy recently, or if you felt disconnected from life, this verse may be exactly what you need. This is a reminder that in God we find fresh air, which is something we all desperately need right now. In God, knowing that He goes ahead of us and fights our battles for us, we can be filled with joy. If we know that God wins all battles, and we take a step back from wanting to constantly control our lives, which we sometimes do, allowing God to work, we should be overcome with joy, because we know then that we will see victory. But, Keegan, you might say, I know that God is where I can find my rest, and in Him I can find joy, but it's just been really difficult to find joy recently. To which I would say it's very rude of you to interrupt me during my devotional. I only have so much time, but for you, let's dig into that. Practically, how is Psalm 16:11 showing us the ways to dwell in God? There are three things to consider specifically from David here, and let's look back to the verse. It starts out with, "You make known to me the path of life." That's the first third of this verse. What does this mean? First, this path of life has been made known to us, and we know what it is. And if that's the case, as much as it may sound like a Sunday school answer sometimes, I think that the path of life that's been shown to us is Jesus. If we know His way, if we know His walk and His words, then we are dwelling with God. If no one makes their way to the Father except through Jesus, then Jesus is that path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In the second third of this verse, it's important to note here that when we're in God's presence, David saying that there is fullness of joy doesn't mean that David is saying that nothing bad will happen to us as Christians or as people. There is a big difference here. Being in God's presence allows us to peer into the why behind earthly things. Finding the why may not be able to happen immediately either. But if we are truly to be in God's presence, then we trust who He is. And we know that all things are working for good in the end through Him. That doesn't mean that bad stuff doesn't happen, or that we don't have the right to feel sad or angry or even distraught when death occurs. But instead, David's pointing out that we can have peace in knowing that God is in control of it all. The universe doesn't rest on our shoulders, but God takes care of that for us. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. This is the last third of this verse and begins to wrap up this devotional. Here, David shows us that if we trust God, if we dwell in Him, if we know who He is, then we know that there are pleasures in store for us after this life. I think that we often get so caught up in the busyness of this life, getting our schoolwork done, going to our meetings, planning for our future, that we forget what our future is actually going towards. In doing that, we risk it all. In 1 Corinthians 9:24, Paul writes that, Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get that prize. That prize for all humans living on this earth, whether they know it or not, is eternal life in heaven with our loving Father. There are people on this earth that don't know they're in a race with a prize at all. Or maybe they think that the prize is something to be attained on earth. But David shows us that the pleasures at God's right hand in heaven are never-ending, uncomparable, and perfect. If I didn't make it clear enough through the rest of this devotional, here, frankly, is the blunt takeaway of everything that I've just said up to this point. One way that we can create clean hearts is through dwelling in God. As through Psalm 16:11, we can dwell in God if we know who Jesus is, proclaiming him to be the path of life. We can dwell in God if we trust his plan, putting his goals ahead of ours, so we find true joy. And lastly, we can dwell in God by living in such a manner, running our race, to glorify him and his kingdom on earth, to later dwell in God, with God in heaven. We were not created to live apart from God, doing our own thing. Our purpose is to dwell with God and to help others to do so too. Here are 2 questions/prompts to hopefully help you unpack this devotion even further on your own time. First, how have you been running your race? Have you been running in such a manner to obtain the prize, or have you been running otherwise? Evaluate your race. The second thing I want you to check out is to think about when was the last time that you took a moment to stop, do nothing, and just listen to what God's telling you. Take some time today or later this week to unplug from all distractions. Go for a walk if you can, staying socially distant. Unplug from all distractions. Take 30 minutes if you have it. 15 minutes is okay too. Just listen to God, and he'll lead you down the right path. Thanks for tuning in to this week's Monday's lunchtime devotional, and make sure to tune in to the rest of this week's too, because as always, there's some really cool stuff happening. Thanks, and I'll see you back here tomorrow, or rather, John will. See ya.